Cynical me thought it was, yeah, this girl, he's a little bit sweet on her, you know what I mean? Like you would.
Jeff Beck was never the type of guitarist to hide his true feelings. Unlike many musicians who smiled for cameras and said nice things in interviews, Beck spoke his mind honestly. His opinions were often harsh, but they came from a genuine place. He dedicated 6 decades of his life to perfecting his craft, searching endlessly for the right note, the perfect tone, and that authentic feeling that cannot be manufactured. When he witnessed other musicians taking easy shortcuts or compromising their art for commercial success, it genuinely upset him. This wasn't cruelty on his part, it was honesty, and there's an important distinction between the two. Beck had spent countless years mastering the guitar through pure obsession and endless experimentation. Every sound that came from his instrument was deliberate and earned through hours of practice and exploration. So when he saw other artists riding on hype alone or hiding their lack of talent behind expensive production techniques, it frustrated him deeply. This wasn't jealousy speaking, it was disappointment, the kind of disappointment you feel when something precious to you gets degraded or cheapened. There were 7 albums in particular that didn't just fall short of Beck's standards, they represented everything he believed was wrong with rock music, the artificial nature of it, the laziness, and the victory of marketing strategies over genuine musical skill. Some of these records sold millions of copies, some received glowing reviews from critics. Beck didn't care about any of that. He could hear past the hype and recognize what was truly present in the music, or more troubling to him, what was absent. The first album that made Beck shake his head was Bon Jovi's Slippery When Wet. This record sold more than 28 million copies around the world, but Beck believed every single copy was a waste of material. When it came out in 1986, the album transformed Bon Jovi into massive stadium-filling stars. Songs like Livin' on a Prayer became anthems that everyone sang. You Give Love a Bad Name dominated music television. Wanted Dead or Alive made the lead singer look like some kind of poetic cowboy figure. American audiences loved it completely. Beck wanted nothing to do with it. His problem wasn't simply that the album was popular. Beck had no issue with success itself. What bothered him was how calculated and manufactured everything sounded. Each note seemed to have been tested by focus groups. Every chorus was engineered specifically to get crowds singing along. The guitar playing was competent enough, but it was extremely safe, never taking any real risks. Richie Sambora played exactly what each song needed and absolutely nothing more. For Beck, who treated his guitar like a living conversation partner, this approach represented musical death. Slippery When Wet symbolized the exact moment when rock music stopped being an art form and became just another product to sell. The entire decade of the 1980s had reduced guitarists to mere accessories in hairspray commercials. Bands stopped asking themselves what they wanted to express artistically. Instead, they asked what would generate sales. Every song on the album sounded like it had been created backwards from a marketing strategy. What do young people want to hear? What will radio stations play? What looks appealing in music videos? When Beck played guitar, he actively searched for those happy accidents that turned into something magical. He looked for wrong notes that somehow felt more correct than the technically right ones. He found beauty in feedback that sang rather than just screamed. He lived in that space between absolute perfection and total chaos, where genuine music actually exists. Bon Jovi eliminated all of that possibility. They wanted music that was radio-friendly, ready for huge arenas, and perfect for selling merchandise. Beck wanted truth in music. These two philosophies couldn't have been more different from each other. The second album Beck despised was Van Halen's 1984. Beck never denied that Eddie Van Halen could really play guitar. The man possessed technical abilities that made other guitarists feel like giving up entirely. However, the 1984 album was where Eddie's genuine talent got buried underneath layers of synthesizers and theatrical spectacle. The opening track, Jump, featured keyboards prominently instead of guitars. The biggest hit on a Van Halen record barely used Eddie's main instrument at all. Beck viewed this as a form of surrender. The album sold more than 10 million copies around the world, but to Beck it represented a supremely talented guitarist abandoning the very thing that made him special. Eddie had completely revolutionized rock guitar playing with his innovative two-handed tapping technique. Now he was playing a secondary role to an Oberheim synthesizer. Songs like Panama and Hot for Teacher brought the guitar back into focus, but the damage had already been done. Beck's problem wasn't with synthesizers as instruments themselves. He had experimented with electronic sounds throughout his own career. His issue was watching Eddie use synthesizers as a crutch rather than as a creative tool. Jump succeeded because it was catchy and memorable, not because it was musically brave. It represented the sound of a true virtuoso choosing to play it safe for commercial glory. What really troubled Beck was the guitar hero worship culture that developed afterward. Suddenly, countless young people with guitars were learning tapping techniques and turning them into party tricks instead of genuine musical expression. Eddie's innovations became cheap gimmicks in less skilled hands. The entire focus shifted away from feeling and toward flash, away from communication and toward competition. Van Halen proved that someone could be incredibly talented while still making choices Beck found disgusting. It was skill without any soul, technique without any real purpose. The album transformed guitar playing from an art form into a competitive sport.
The third album Beck hated was Pink Floyd's The Wall. This 1979 double album was praised as a masterpiece by most critics. Roger Waters channeled his psychological struggles into 26 tracks exploring themes of isolation, fascism, and mental breakdown. Critics described it as ambitious, important, and groundbreaking. Jeff Beck called it unbearably pretentious and self-important. The Wall wasn't really an album in the traditional sense. It was more like homework. You didn't simply listen to it casually. You had to study it carefully, decode all the symbolism, and sit through countless metaphors while the message got hammered into your head for 80 minutes straight. Beck had absolutely no patience for this approach. Music that required an instruction manual wasn't real music to him. It was theater pretending to be something much deeper than it actually was. Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2, became a huge commercial hit, but even that felt calculated and manipulative to Beck. It featured a children's choir singing about education problems over a disco beat underneath social commentary. It worked successfully from a commercial standpoint, but Beck heard the manipulation behind it. The song wasn't organic or natural. It was deliberately constructed to make a political point while simultaneously selling millions of records. What made Beck angriest was how the guitar essentially disappeared under multiple layers of production. David Gilmour was a brilliant guitar player, but The Wall suffocated his instrument underneath synthesizers, sound effects, and conceptual weight. Comfortably Numb featured an iconic guitar solo, but listeners had to wade through enormous amounts of self-important buildup to finally reach it. Beck believed that music should impact you immediately, not 3 songs into an album after you've figured out the entire narrative structure. The Wall demanded your complete attention and total submission to Waters' artistic vision. Beck thought this was arrogant and unnecessary. Good music doesn't require listeners to work that hard. It simply works on its own. The fourth album Beck hated personally because it involved Eric Clapton's Journeyman. Beck and Clapton had come up together in London's blues music scene. They had pushed each other forward, challenged each other constantly, and genuinely respected each other's dedication to the craft. Then Clapton's 1989 album Journeyman was released, and Beck watched his old rival essentially give up on artistic growth. The album wasn't terrible, which almost made it worse. It was competent, professional, and completely uninspired. Clapton played like he was simply going through the required motions, hitting his marks without ever really being present emotionally. Bad Love had radio-friendly polish, but no real substance underneath.
Before You Accuse Me was a blues cover that added absolutely nothing new to the original version. The entire record felt like Clapton just collecting an easy paycheck. Beck couldn't understand this transformation. Here was one of the greatest blues guitarists alive, deliberately playing beneath his actual ability because the music was safe and unchallenging. There were no risks taken, no chances of failure, just smooth, adult contemporary rock that wouldn't offend anyone or challenge anything meaningful. Clapton had gotten comfortable in his success, and comfort was the absolute enemy of great art, according to Beck. What made Beck angriest was all the wasted potential. Clapton could still play brilliantly when he actually wanted to, but Journeyman proved he didn't want to anymore. He had discovered a commercial formula that worked financially and decided to stop pushing himself artistically. For Beck, who constantly reinvented his sound and approach, this was completely unforgivable. The production quality was too clean and sterile. Everything sounded expensive but lifeless. Clapton's guitar tone, which had once been raw and powerful, now sounded like it had been tested by focus groups. All the rough edges had been smoothed away carefully. The danger had been completely removed. What remained was pleasant background music for people who had stopped really listening to music. The fifth album Beck hated was the Sex Pistols' Never Mind the Bollocks. Punk rock exploded onto the scene in 1977, declaring loudly that traditional musicianship was completely irrelevant. The Sex Pistols members couldn't really play their instruments properly. They openly admitted this fact and even celebrated it proudly. Never Mind the Bollocks sold this incompetence as authentic expression, and an entire generation of young people bought into it. Jeff Beck, who had dedicated his entire life to mastering his craft, found this approach deeply insulting. Anarchy in the UK crashed through 3 basic chords like they were the only 3 chords that existed in music. God Save the Queen snarled with rebellious attitude, but displayed almost zero musical sophistication. Pretty Vacant lived up to its title completely. The album's raw energy was impossible to deny, but so was its fundamental lack of actual skill. Beck wasn't some musical snob who believed you needed formal conservatory training to create good music. He genuinely loved raw blues players who had never read a single note of music in their lives. But those players possessed genuine feeling, natural instinct, and something meaningful to communicate through their instruments. The Sex Pistols just had rage and publicity stunts. They made a virtue out of refusing to learn their instruments properly. What bothered Beck most was the massive influence this had. Suddenly, thousands of young people picked up guitars and formed bands without bothering to learn how to play first. Punk rock said this was perfectly fine, that passion mattered more than ability. Beck thought this philosophy was simply lazy. Passion and skill weren't enemies of each other. The very best music came from possessing both qualities together.
The sixth album that disgusted Beck was Rod Stewart's Foolish Behavior. Rod Stewart had been Beck's singer years earlier. Together, they had created some of the rawest and most powerful rock music of the late 1960s. Then Rod found solo success and slowly began chasing trends instead of making genuine music. By the time Foolish Behavior came out in 1980, he had completely abandoned everything they had built together. The album chased disco trends, chased pop music, chased whatever was selling that particular week. The song Passion dripped with synthesizers and string sections. Tonight's the Night might have been romantic, but it was also calculated for maximum radio play. A genuine blues shouter had transformed into someone making music suitable for dentist office waiting rooms. The voice was still technically there, but the spirit had completely left. Rod sang these songs like he was reading a grocery list out loud. It was professional and adequate, but dead inside. What killed Beck emotionally was knowing exactly what Rod was truly capable of creating. Truth, their first album together, had been raw and dangerous. Rod's voice could communicate pain, joy, desire, and everything that made rock and roll actually matter to people. Foolish Behavior proved that Rod had traded all of that authenticity for easy money and soft rock radio play. Beck had turned down multiple reunion offers with Rod over the years. This album confirmed he had made the right choice every time.
They no longer spoke the same musical language at all. Rod had learned to speak corporate music industry language. Beck still only spoke the truth. The gulf between them had become permanent and impossibly vast. The album Jeff Beck hated most was actually his own record, called There and Back. Released in 1980, this album was supposed to follow up on the fusion jazz success of his earlier albums, Blow by Blow and Wired. Instead, it became the record that haunted him for decades afterward. Every time someone praised it, Beck would physically wince. They were hearing something he simply couldn't hear in it. All he heard were the compromises he had made. The record label wanted another commercial winner. They pushed hard for tighter songs, cleaner production values, and less experimental risk-taking. Beck gave in more than he wanted to admit to himself. Songs like Space Boogie and The Pump were solid enough, but they played it much safer than his musical instincts had demanded. Star Cycle had some interesting moments, but they were buried under production choices that made him cringe whenever he heard them. The album sold well commercially. Critics were generally kind in their reviews. None of that mattered to Beck at all. He knew exactly where he had compromised his artistic vision, where he had let time pressure and commercial expectations push him away from what he really wanted to create. You can please the record label and please the fans while still knowing deep in your gut that you failed yourself. There and Back taught Beck a lesson he never forgot for the rest of his career. Never again would he release something he didn't believe in completely and totally. His later albums took much longer to create and sold fewer copies, but they represented his actual artistic vision without compromise. He would rather release nothing at all than release something mediocre with his name attached to it. Jeff Beck's hatred for these albums came from a place of deep love for music. He despised these records because he cared too much about music to accept mediocrity in any form. Every record he criticized revealed clearly what he valued most: honesty over hype, artistic risk over commercial safety, genuine soul over sales figures. His anger was never petty or small-minded. It was the righteous fury of a master craftsman watching his beloved art form get cheapened and degraded. Sometimes the music you hate defines you just as much as the music you love.